The engine rattled once, a metallic death throw, before the bus shuddered to a final heavy halt. Outside, the edge of town was a graveyard of rusted metal and overgrown concrete. It was 11:47 p.m. Mark sat in the driver's seat, the silence of the cabin pressing against his eardrums like deep water. Beyond the windshield, the station platform was reclaimed by thick, tangled weeds that choked the stone gaps. Above the entrance, a solitary street lamp flickered in a rhythmic, dying pulse, casting long. Every blink of the light seemed to drain a little more warmth from the air. Mark gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, staring at the empty shelter. He knew the company manual by heart. He knew the rule about this stop. Do not open the doors. Do not acknowledge the platform. But the silence outside was heavy, expectant, and entirely unnatural. Rain began to drum against the roof, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the world into a blur of gray water and shifting shadows. The bus was trapped in the center of a dead world, and the light above the station flickered one last time before holding steady, illuminating the rain-slicked ground. Mark leaned forward, his forehead against the cool glass. Through the curtain of rain, a shape emerged under the rusted shelter. It was a woman, motionless, her back to the tracks. She was a dark stain against the gray landscape. Mark checked the dashboard, his eyes flicking to the manual taped near the gear shift. The rule was clear: no stops, no exceptions. Yet, the woman remained fixed to the spot, the downpour failing to wash away her silhouette. She did not shiver, did not seek cover, and did not turn. A strange, rhythmic pulsing started in Mark's temples, echoing the flicker of the street lamp outside. It felt as though the air inside the bus was thickening, pulling his attention toward the door controls like a magnet drawing steel. He gripped the steering wheel, his fingers trembling. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to put the bus in gear and leave this place behind. But then the woman shifted, just slightly, and the weight of that movement hit the bus with the force of a physical blow. Mark reached out. His hand hovered inches from the pneumatic switch. The silence of the bus was no longer empty. It was waiting. He felt the cold seep through the rubber seals of the doors, urging him to break the rule. Mark tapped the switch. The pneumatic hiss sounded unusually sharp, tearing through the steady drone of the rain. The doors shivered, then groaned open. The woman moved forward. She crossed the threshold with a fluid, soundless grace that ignored the pooling water on the pavement. As she stepped into the cabin, the temperature plummeted. The condensation on the windows instantly turned to jagged frost, spreading in complex crystalline patterns that obscured the outside world. Mark gasped, his breath hitching as a plume of white vapor escaped his lips. The air was no longer just cold, it was suffocatingly frigid, carrying the scent of damp earth and deep winter. He watched her walk down the narrow aisle, her presence drawing the warmth out of the metal and plastic around her. She passed his seat, and he felt a sharp, piercing ache in his chest, a sudden, heavy intuition that he had committed an irreversible error. She did not look at him. She moved straight to the very back row, her form dissolving into the deep shadows near the rear window. Mark sat frozen, his hands still resting on the door control, while the cold settled into the marrow of his bones. He had opened the door, and now the silence felt hungry. Mark jammed the transmission into drive and pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between himself and the station. The engine roared, struggling to push the heavy vehicle forward through the slick, rain-drenched streets. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, forcing his eyes to stay fixed on the road ahead. He needed to focus on the route. He needed to ignore the unnatural frost coating the interior panels. At the first intersection, he risked a glance into the rearview mirror. He expected to see the woman, perhaps watching him from the back row. Instead, the mirror showed only rows of empty, gray seats. He blinked, shifting his position to get a better angle, but the back row remained vacant. Nothing. No shadow, no movement, no trace of her. The bus felt cavernous, the space behind him stretching out into a void. The rain continued to drum against the roof, but the sound seemed distant now, swallowed by a thick, heavy silence that pressed against his eardrums. He was alone in the cabin, yet the air remained biting, a lingering frost that refused to dissipate despite the engine heat. The bus groaned as it crawled down the main thoroughfare. Mark kept his eyes locked on the road, but the darkness outside the windows felt thicker, more tactile. A sudden, sharp chill crawled up his spine, not like a draft, but like a cold hand pressing into his skin. He shifted in his seat, his muscles tensing against the unnatural drop in temperature. The engine rhythm sputtered, losing its steady hum, as if the machine itself were struggling to breathe. Mark slowed the bus, his foot hovering over the brake pedal. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt dry, constricted by a rising, irrational panic. He glanced at the dashboard. The dials were spinning wildly, needles flicking back and forth between empty and full. The silence of the night was replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the floorboards. He knew he should keep driving, just keep going, but the weight of the air in the cabin had changed. It felt heavy, electric, and intensely predatory. He gripped the steering wheel until his palms ached. He had to look. He had to know what was waiting for him in the darkness of the back row. He took a long, ragged breath, tightened his grip, and began to tilt his head toward the mirror. The mirror tilted. Mark's eyes caught the reflection, expecting the empty seats he had seen moments before. Instead, the glass revealed a different reality. Every single row was now occupied. Men in tattered, threadbare materials sat with rigid posture, their frames hunched against the bench seats. Beside them, women with hollow, pale features stared forward, their skin looking like stretched parchment under the dim overhead light. Not a single one of them moved. The cabin, which had been empty a moment ago, was now packed with dozens of silent, unblinking figures. Mark felt the breath hitch in his throat, a sharp, jagged sound in the sudden stillness. He slammed his foot onto the brake, but the bus didn't jerk. It glided to a smooth, unnatural halt, as if guided by an unseen hand. He tried to turn his head to verify the sight, but his neck muscles refused to obey. He was locked in place, forced to witness the reflection. The figures were closer than they should have been, their presence filling every gap of the bus with a stagnant, graveyard chill. He stared at the mirror, his pupils dilating as the true scale of the infestation became clear. He was trapped. Mark watched the reflection, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The figures sat in total stillness, a sea of pale, hollow faces. Then, the rhythm shifted. It was not a chaotic movement, but a calculated, synchronized action. A soft, dry sound of scraping bone filled the bus as every head turned toward the front at the exact same moment. Dozens of vacant, sightless eyes locked onto Mark through the mirror. He tried to shout, but his voice died in his throat, choked off by the sheer weight of their collective gaze. The air in the cabin grew thick, smelling of wet earth and dust. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, but he could not force his body to move away from the sight. The overhead lights flickered with a harsh, buzzing drone, casting long, erratic shadows across the aisle. One final, violent surge of current pulsed through the bulbs. Then, with a sharp final click, the light died. The bus plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against his ears, while the feeling of dozens of unseen eyes remained fixed on his back in the blackness. The darkness was not empty. It was crowded, heavy with the sound of shallow, rattling breaths that did not belong to him. Mark remained rigid, his eyes wide, trying to pierce the blackness that swallowed the dashboard and the road ahead. A movement stirred behind his left shoulder, the friction of something cold brushing against his neck. A face leaned forward, its presence inches from his ear, carrying the scent of damp soil and ancient, stagnant air. The voice was a dry, rasping rattle that seemed to vibrate through his own jaw. "You let her in." The words hung in the air, a final, chilling indictment. Before Mark could react, the bus lurched. It surged forward with a sudden, violent force. Though his foot had not touched the pedal, he lunged for the steering wheel, fingers straining to correct the path. But his hands met no resistance. They passed through the metal as if it were nothing more than mist. He grabbed again, desperate, but his palms slid through the solid frame. The bus accelerated, tearing through the night, while Mark realized with a jolt of terror that he was no longer the one in control of his own body. The bus tore through the night, a runaway vessel guided by unseen hands. Mark watched the world blur into a smear of gray, his physical form flickering like a dying flame. The road beneath the tires groaned, a metallic shriek that echoed the tension in his own fading awareness. Suddenly, the motion buckled. The bus slammed into a deceleration so brutal it threw Mark forward, his chest slamming against the dashboard with a dull, hollow thud. He tried to brace himself, but his arms offered no leverage, sliding through the console as if he were made of smoke. The engine sputtered, wheezed, and then died with a final, jarring clatter. The bus skidded across the uneven gravel of the terminal, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust before locking into place with a definitive, bone-shaking screech. Silence rushed back in, absolute and heavy. Mark stared through the cracked windshield at the familiar, weed-choked platform. The street lamp flickered once, twice, then steadied. Without a touch from any hand, the hydraulic system hissed. The heavy rubber seals groaned against the frame, and the doors swung wide, exposing the interior to the cold, damp night air. The path to the outside was open, but the weight of the air made it clear that there was nowhere left to run. The first light of dawn crawled over the horizon, turning the gray sky into a pale, bruised violet. The weeds around the abandoned station stood tall, heavy with dew, swaying in a wind that made no sound. The bus remained exactly where it had skidded to a halt, a rusted shell resting in the overgrown grass. Inside, the cabin was a tomb of silence. The morning sun pierced through the windshield, illuminating the rows of empty seats where, only hours before, the pale faces had sat in stillness. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, and no trace of the driver. The driver's seat was vacant, the steering wheel motionless, catching the weak morning rays. A slow movement caught the light in the back row. Tucked against the floorboards, a piece of dark fabric lay discarded, snagged on a rusted bolt. It was a black veil, thin and fragile, settled on the floor as if dropped in haste. The bus was utterly empty. Mark was gone, leaving only the stillness of the morning and the heavy, lingering weight of the night to witness what had occurred in